Hello and welcome to my Scholars Day presentation. My name is Jonathan Gehring and I'm studying the third person effect. My professor is Dr. Alexander Moe and this is JRB 467, Mass Communication Theory. Before we move forward with our research, let's define the third person effect. It is defined, according to communication scholars, as a hypothesis predicting that people perceive mass media messages as having a greater impact on others than of themselves. So basically, it's the effect that says that you think that other people fall for things that you don't. You see a message on TV, a commercial is a classic example, and you think, oh, I'm not going to fall for that. I'm not going to buy that product. But you think that other people might. You see them as more vulnerable than yourself. Communication scholars have been studying the third person effect for a long time now, and typically meta analyses have found a statistically significant difference between how people feel they are impacted by messages and how they feel others are. So basically, communication research has shown that the third person effect is a legitimate phenomenon. Paul Salwin and Dupagny in 2009 studied 32 studies, and they found that college age individuals and younger especially have this idea when it comes to feeling others are more vulnerable than themselves in relation to media consumption. Phillips in 83 came to the conclusion that the third person effect may actually lead to some harmful effects, and that media consumption habits as a result can be harmful. Eisend in 2017 found that it's not just advertising, as classically thought. The third person effect also has an impact on entertainment and informational media content. Now, I'm interested in the concept of violence, and this hasn't been studied a lot, but Perloff in 1999, that study has influenced what I want to study. But first, let's back up and ask the question, why is the third person effect even a thing? Do we even know exactly why? Well, not totally, but we have a pretty good idea. People naturally consider themselves immune to media messages because they don't feel themselves change after being exposed to them. But on the contrary, you might be able to witness in someone else how a media message is changing them, like a commercial, for example. As you're watching it, you don't necessarily feel your spending habits change, but you might be able to witness that in someone else. It's not only advertising that this is clear in, also take news networks, for example, like Fox News and CNN, two networks that many would say have some pretty clear political bias. And research suggests that people, viewers, are in fact impacted by them, and it might change their political bias. But viewers don't feel this change. As they've been surveyed, they haven't said, oh yeah, I watch this news network and it makes me more conservative or more liberal, but research shows that it actually does, and that's the third person effect in a real life example. So back to media violence. It is difficult to find research on the third-person effect and media violence. Perloff's 1999 study that just hints at it a little bit was my motivation here for digging deeper into it. Media violence, though, it's important to define it because it's quite a broad term. It can include video games, television news, we see it a lot in movies, and even social media. Increasingly, we see more and more violent, either multimedia, social media posts, or just violent messages on social media. That counts. So the question is, how does the way we see ourselves viewing violent media compared to the way we see others viewing it? And again, that is the very essence of the third person effect. So my research focuses in on the Brockport community. Is the third person effect a real phenomenon here? It focuses on as many different community members as possible. I was able to survey 112 demographically diverse individuals, even in the midst of these circumstances, was able to complete these surveys. So thank you to everyone who participated. These people were surveyed on their violent media consumption habits and their feelings about the habits of themselves and others. And based on the research that I found here, I focus especially in on the concern we have for others who view violent media compared to the maybe less concern that we have for ourselves as we view violent messages. But I won't give everything away here. You're going to have to wait till the end of the presentation. So this research, as much communication research is done, was done through a survey. So what did I ask our participants? So first, I asked them how many hours weekly they estimate they're exposed to potentially violent media content. Now, it's important to define what violent media content is, as I detailed earlier in the presentation, but also it's important to understand that potentially violent media content does not just mean the actual violent scenes of the content. A 2-hour movie, for example, may only have several violent scenes, but the entire thing is considered potentially violent because you're on edge, preparing to maybe see something violent. You're ready for it, so to speak. So it's important to consider some of the other things that we don't always think of as violent media, like even time spent on social media in certain circumstances may be considered exposure to potentially violent media, and video games as well, certainly. And I just wanted to get a base for all of our participants to see where they stand, their violent media consumption habits. And then I asked participants to rate on a scale of 1 to 10 several questions here. I know this is potentially problematic because, well, first of all, people have a tendency to lie on surveys, but I don't think anyone in the Brockport community would do that. We are such an honest group of people here, so hoping not for that. And also just the fact that someone's 1 may be different than another person's 1, or someone might define a 5 or a 6 or a 10 differently. So we have that obstacle, so it may not be the best way to research this, but I think it is given our circumstances here in spring of 2020. So on a scale of 1 to 10, I asked participants to rate their comfort level with violent media. Overall comfort level. 1 is you're very uncomfortable with violence, and all the way up to 10, which would be like, oh, I do not mind violence at all in media. I'll watch blood and gore and all sorts of stuff. Also, how negative or positive is this content? What kind of impact does it have on them is exactly how the phrasing of that question was. 1, if you feel very negatively impacted, like you watch something violent and it just hurts, it just kind of ruins your day, or you just feel like it has a negative impact on you. And 10, if you feel sort of invigorated by it, if it's something that you feel might have a positive impact. Also, where do you consider yourself in relation to your 10 closest friends or family when it comes to violent media consumption? I thought, I asked them to think of people close to them and think of just how much violent media content they consume in comparison to others, especially those close to them that they may actually have an idea of their violent media consumption habits. And how negative or positive do you feel this content is in your loved ones or your friends' daily lives? Do you think that they are invigorated by that violence, or do you think that it disturbs them or bothers them or has any other negative impact on them? That, again, I asked them to rate on a scale of 1 to 10. So now the moment of truth as we dive into exactly what I found with our 112 participants here in the Brockport community of these questions. Well, here's the chart, and it actually extends way beyond this slide. I was struggling to fit it on one slide, and I just gave up. So there it is. It's not really that important, and it probably doesn't make much sense to you. But let's dive into exactly what I found based on all of this data. What I found here, based on what our 112 respondents told me, was very interesting. We find that the third person effect is alive here in the Brockport community. It's kind of scary, but also not too surprising. We see consistent data with the previous research, as there is a noticeable difference between how much participants thought media violence impacted them and how much they thought it impacted others. And how does this look with when it comes to the actual numbers and the data? The average rating of self-concern over media violence, again on a scale of 1 to 10, was approximately 3.2, so quite low. But when it comes to concern for others and their consumption of media violence, well, that was about 3.9, which still is below 5, below, I guess, what you would call average concern. So we're not really that concerned about media violence, I guess, for ourselves or for others, but we are more concerned for others than we are for ourselves. And that is at least one facet of the third person effect, because we believe that, by extension, we must believe that this media violence is having more of an impact on others than it is on ourselves. I also found a positive correlation with the general comfort level of media violence. Remember, I asked on a scale of 1 to 10, how comfortable are you with media violence? And the effect that people feel that it has on them, the positive effect. They feel that it has a more positive effect if they're more comfortable with it. That makes sense. Most people that felt comfortable in that 7 to 10 range either felt that it was neutral to them or it actually had a positive effect. And vice versa. On the other hand, if you don't feel comfortable with media, we, based on the research, saw that those people, well, they thought that that had more of a negative effect on them. Now, the level of concern for oneself in regards to media violence was also positively correlated with the level of concern for others, which makes sense. If you feel like media violence is a bad thing for you, you tend to also think that it's a bad thing for others, and vice versa. However, as I just said in the previous slide, this was not necessarily the same. Our level of concern for ourselves was not quite as much for that of others. Also, I found it was interesting that there were a lot of 5 responses on our scale of 1 to 10 questions, suggesting maybe there's a sense of indifference towards media violence. I don't want to put words in any of our participants' mouth, but maybe some people feel that it really isn't a big deal. 27 of the 112 respondents thought that, well, they gave it a 5, so they gave it right that middle rating from 1 to 10 when they were asked to rate their comfort level with media violence. So 27 of our 112 thought, I guess I'm kind of comfortable with media violence. When it comes to whether it had a negative or positive effect on them, well, 45 of the 112 respondents responded with a 5. So neither too negative, neither too positive. And 38 of them responded with a 5 when it came to how negative or positive they felt the content was in others' daily lives. So very interesting how so many 5s. I don't know if that's just like survey fatigue, people just sort of putting the middle number not to go one direction or the other, but I think it really says something about our participants and how they feel about media violence, and that maybe, while it isn't the best thing, but it's also not that big of a deal. Again, not trying to put words in their mouth, but it's interesting. And here's some other interesting things that I found. Just of those surveyed 24 and under, which were a lot, actually 45 of our 112 participants were 24 and under, I tried to get a good cross-section of the Brockport community, and the Brockport community, well, being a college town, does have a lot of 24 and under people, so it worked out, and I really think I did capture a good cross-section of Brockport. But of those 45 individuals, over half of them consider themselves to be less vulnerable to violent media messages than others, including their elders. So that is consistent with the first study that I researched as I was doing background research on this. Paul Salwin and Dupagny in 2009 suggested that the third person effect is stronger in younger individuals, and that's what I found when it came to people 24 and under. Also, almost 3/4 of all participants considered their consumption of violent media to be below average in comparison to that of their 10 closest family members or friends. So basically, 75% of people figured that their family and friends actually gets more exposure to media violence than them. And this can't really be the case. I mean, not everybody can be below average. Only 50% are below average. I mean, it could be the case with this particular sample size, but typically I think this does say something about people who might consider themselves to not view as much violent media as others, which is very interesting because it might help explain exactly why the third person effect is such a real thing when it comes to media violence. Also, of the 18 individuals who claim that violent media has a moderately positive to very positive effect on them, again, that 7 to 10 range, I consider that, only 4 are over the age of 30. So 14 out of 18 are under 30, and I suppose that is also consistent with the research that shows that more violent media is consumed by younger people especially. So that just shows that that research is consistent. But that concept is known as catharsis, that very positive effect that some people report violent media has on them, because it's a release. And that's what the idea of catharsis is, that it's violent media is justified because it releases those sort of violent impulses within you and actually makes you less likely to commit violent acts in real life. But I guess that's a whole nother presentation for another time that hopefully maybe somebody is doing on Scholars Day. I kind of doubt it, actually, but it's besides the point here. But it's very interesting that, again, the younger people tend to consume more violent content and also tend to feel themselves are less vulnerable in comparison to their elders. In conclusion, I think it is safe to say, based on my research here, that the third person effect is a real phenomenon in the Brockport community. I guess unless I found the 112 people who feel differently than everyone else, but that seems very unlikely, and I mean, your sample size has to stop somewhere, right? So younger people especially are exposed to more violence on a weekly basis in media, as we found. That was one of the big findings of this study, I think, one of my big takeaways, but they don't often consider it as detrimental to their well-being, at least in comparison to their peers or to their elders. We saw those numbers of hours of violent media consumption up over 20 a week for a lot of these younger individuals, which was a lot more than the older people. As a general rule of thumb, that's like 3 hours a day or more that younger people were saying they watch violent media. Now, many people, as we said, feel that others see more violent media than they do, and that's that 75% number of people feeling that they are below average when it comes to how much violent media they consume than everybody else, or, as I asked them, than their 10 closest family members or friends. So this is really interesting to me because only half of us can be below average, right? But yet we all kind of think that we are. So this really leads to a question that can prompt some further research that I'd like to do on what actually causes the third person effect. Does it come as a result of perceptions of varying abilities to deal with it? So basically, we all feel that we can deal with the violence that we see on TV better than others, and we're concerned for others because we feel like maybe they're more vulnerable to that violence. That's what we originally have thought about the third person effect. Or maybe this is a real phenomenon because it's a result of an incorrect perception of how much violent media we actually consume. So basically, we underestimate how much violent media we consume, and or we overestimate how much others consume. And since we think that others consume so much, we feel more concern for them. Or maybe it's that we don't actually consume as much as we think we do. So that raises another question that's interesting when it comes to what might actually be causing the third person effect. But this research does suggest that it is real, and that was the goal of this research. So I would say that it was a very compelling study. Thank you so much for listening to me ramble on for 15 minutes about my Scholars Day research. And if you have any questions or comments, if you loved it or hated it, this presentation, then just shoot me an email at jgoeh, the number 1, at brockport.edu. Thanks so much. Enjoy the rest of Scholars Day, and most importantly, stay safe.